Welcome to the Everyday Conversion Podcast, the only 5-day-a-week podcast helping faithful members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have and foster daily gospel discussions with their families based on the Come Follow Me curriculum. I'm your host, Mark Sieverkrop, and it's important for me to tell you up front that the views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the hosts of this podcast alone and do not represent the official doctrine and viewpoint of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. With that in mind, let's jump right in with today's episode. So today is the day of Christ's trial and crucifixion. And again, there was just way too much information and too much that goes on to even hope to be able to cover all of it in this episode. So I was reading through it and I was studying. I was reading Jesus the Christ. I was reading the scriptures. I was reading all the different accounts, trying to figure out what can I talk about during this episode that relates to Christ's trial and crucifixion and burial that would allow me to do it in a less than 3-hour time frame. And as I was studying, one theme kept coming back to my mind. I kept noticing one single thing, and that was the Savior's demeanor during horribly unjust and downright illegal legal proceedings that led to his laughable conviction and death. You know, I was reading Jesus Christ. I highly recommend taking a look at this. Let me see if I can find. I don't even know. I'll link to it in the show notes. But it's chapter 34, the trial and condemnation. Read through it. Go read that. I'll link to it. You can find it on the church's website for free, or if you have the book, go read it, because the entire processional was just one after another of broken rules and laws that the Sanhedrin just completely ignored. You know, from having a trial at night, which they weren't supposed to do, to having a trial that wasn't in their meeting place. It was at Caiaphas, the chief priest, the high priest's house. To, you know, not, or to, what was it? Violating the Savior's right to not have his own testimony be used against him, to not being able to get two witnesses to say the same thing, to testify the same thing, just over and over again, to the next day, the Savior, they had a second trial. Anytime that somebody was convicted of a capital crime, of something that could lead to the death penalty, they had to have a second trial. And if no one was on the side, if the vote was unanimous, the person was supposed to be released, because their opinion was if they didn't have a friend or a defender within the group, then something was wrong. That, it could have just been a group of everybody against somebody rather than it being legal and just, which of course is exactly what was happening. So in that case, the case should have been thrown out anyways. So it was one after another of just horribly, when you read through it, you read Elder Talmage's description of it, you realize that this really was a group of people who were so far gone with regards to emotionally just wanting this man dead that they just threw everything out the window. They threw every legal precedence, every legal procedure, every legal, every rule and law out the window in order to convict and to kill him. That's how bad it was. So the way the Savior responded during these proceedings is unbelievable, and it's really, really admirable. Quite honestly, it was Christ-like, which makes sense. But, and it made me think of in 3 Nephi chapter 11, when the Savior visits the Americas after his resurrection. And he says this, he says, I say unto you, he that hath the spirit of contention is not of me, but is of the devil, who is the father of contention. and he stirreth up the hearts of men to contend with anger one with another. Behold, this is not my doctrine, to stir up the hearts of men with anger one against another, but this is my doctrine, that such things should be done away. And that was verses 29 and 30. And Christ lived those words during the most intense, unfair, and hostile moments of his mortal life. This time of the trials and the crucifixion, and being shuttled back and forth between Ananias and Caiaphas and Pilate and the governor, and one after another just moved back and forth. Like, he lived this. He avoided contention. Now, we'll get to this a little bit later too, but this doesn't mean he was weak, and it doesn't mean that he was avoiding confrontation, but he acted in a Christ-like manner. He acted in a noble and a kingly manner. Here's a few that I found. He peacefully went with those that came for him when they were in Gethsemane. He even healed the one guy who Peter cut his ear off. He healed his ear. When he was accused by Caiaphas, it says Jesus held his peace. When he was asked if he was the Christ, he said, "Thou hast said," or "Thou sayest." So, essentially just saying, well, that's what you're saying. He didn't argue with him, just said, that's what you're saying. Essentially saying, this isn't, you're not going to listen to me regardless, so whatever you say. It's kind of what he said, but he did it in a noble manner. When he was beaten and spit upon, he said nothing. When he was before the governor, I really like this one. It says, quote, "He answered him never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly." So the way he carried himself led to the governor being to marveling, to being amazed at the way he was responding to this entire situation. So again, don't confuse this with weakness or avoiding conflicts. There was times that he did respond and he did speak. There was one time where there's a few times where he basically said, look, if I answer you, you're not going to believe me anyways. And if I ask you a question, you're not going to respond to me. So he did respond, but everything he did was in a very noble and kingly way, and it was not with anger. I think that's the key. Like he said in 3 Nephi, you don't want to contend with anger, and I'm blown away that he was able to do that. So if ever, like I said, if ever there was a person who had a right to be upset, to be angry, to be appalled at the way he was being treated, it was Christ. Yet he remained always Christ-like, which obviously is why we refer to that as being Christ-like. But he acted in a manner that is noble and that we should all aspire to. So my questions to you today are, what can we learn about facing difficult and unfair situations from the Savior's example? And the second one is more broad. It's, what other thoughts or lessons come to mind for you as you ponder Christ's trial, his crucifixion, and his burial? My encouragement to you today, because we cannot go into everything that happened, take some time to read Matthew 27 or John 19 or both with your family or by yourself, and consider how the apostles must have felt during this time. This time where their leader, their friend, this man that they've spent years with at this point, is taken from them, and they see the injustices that are happening. Peter, let his anger get the best of him. They're watching from afar. It says that they were watching as all this stuff happened. How did they feel? How would you have felt? Consider those things as you read those. Put yourself in their position, because as you put yourself in their position of how they must have felt during the crucifixion and the trial and the burial and his death, then you'll be in a position on Sunday morning to put yourself in the position of how they must have felt when they found out that he was no longer dead, that he had been resurrected. So again, the two questions. What can we learn about facing difficult and unfair situations from the Savior's example? And the second one, what other thoughts or lessons come to mind as you ponder Christ's trial, crucifixion, and burial? And I guess that there was a third one there too, which is, consider, how would you have felt? How do you think the apostles felt during this time of Christ's trial and crucifixion? Now, I don't know. I've considered doing a podcast over the weekend to talk about Easter specifically. I don't know if that'll happen. So if it doesn't, may you have a wonderful Easter. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being a part of this project. Thank you for sharing your testimony and sharing this podcast with others. And I hope you have an absolutely wonderful Easter. I look forward to coming back and sharing more with you next week. But this weekend, my kids are singing in sacrament meeting, and I'm super excited. The young men and young women are singing with the primary, and as a leader in the young men's, I get to sing with them as well. So I'll be singing as well. But I look forward to worshiping on Easter Sunday with my family, and I hope you do the same. And we will see you next week. Thank you for listening to the Everyday Conversion Podcast. For transcripts and other bonus materials, as well as past episodes, be sure to visit everydayconversion.com. And if you haven't yet, be sure to leave us a rating and review on iTunes or your favorite podcast listening platform. This episode was a production of the Everyday Conversion Podcast, and while we are faithful members of the church, the views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the hosts of this podcast alone and do not represent the official doctrine and viewpoint of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For official doctrine and viewpoints of the church, please visit lds.org